The year was 2279 BC. In the royal palace of Akkad in modern-day Iraq, a great ruler was on his deathbed. Healers had tried everything to save his life, but it was in vain. Now it was the time of the priests and their prayers. The old Sargon of Akkad, a man of humble origins that had conquered all the cities of Mesopotamia, murmured something. In his 56 years of rule, he had forged an empire in fire and blood. His domain spanned from modern-day Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. Never before him a single man had ruled over such a vast land. But do you know the old saying, "You can build a throne out of bayonets, but you can't sit on it for long"? How long will Sargon's empire last? Sargon, king of Akkad, king of Sumer, king of the universe, closed his eyes in eternal sleep. The king is dead, long live the king. What was going to happen now? From the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, hundreds of thousands of worried people were pondering this question. The majority of people didn't care about politics, as farmlands and herds had higher priority. Many had benefited from the forging of this new empire, and they made a toast to Rimush, son of Sargon. But not everyone was ready to swear fealty to the new king of the universe. Behind closed doors, many were sharpening their blades. Sargon was an Akkadian, so he was a foreigner to the eyes of Sumerians. He had tried to respect their culture, but you can forge an empire without creating enemies everywhere. A voice ran wild in the land. "The city of Ur is rebelling, and Umma is joining too." Quickly the kings of Adab, Lagash, Der and Kazulu joined the rebellion. If Rimush had hoped that his father had left him a pacified empire, then he was very wrong. But if the rebelling kings hoped that Rimush wasn't cut from his father's cloth, well, they were even more wrong. Rimush was ready to fight for his crown. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of the fall of the first empire in history. This is the story of the Sargonic dynasty. Welcome to the Mists of Time. The entire land of Sumer was in rebellion. In a hurry, Rimush's officials started to run city by city, town by town, village by village. The message: all warriors must gather at once. Thousands of archers and spearmen answered the call. The elite of the army was the war wagons units. Pulled by wild donkeys, they could make the enemies tremble with a terrible charge. The war had begun. Sadly, the details of this conflict have been lost in the mists of time. But the most peculiar of the historical facts had survived to our days. Rimush ordered his accountants to carefully record the number of the fallen enemies. The king racked up a hefty death toll. 56,041 people were killed. 29,438 were reduced to slavery. 25,685 were exiled. For the Sumerians, it was a disaster, especially because the biggest city at the time had merely 80,000 citizens. The Great Sumerian Rebellion was over. Rimush was indeed cut from his father's cloth. To finalize his conquest, the king expropriated 134,000 hectares of fertile land between the cities of Lagash and Duma. He gave this land to his most loyal supporters. The king of the universe had enemies everywhere, and he had to reward his allies. But bear in mind that his act was not only about generosity toward friends and allies. he had a clever plan in mind. By giving so much Sumerian land to his Akkadian loyalists, he created a new class of landowners who were disconnected from the local networks of power. Never more a rebellion like this one had to happen. Yet this was still not sufficient to gain hegemony over Mesopotamia. The ruthless Rimush could beat his enemies on the battlefield. But could he beat the enemies in his palace? The king's Barutu, his diviner, entered the king's room. Rimush, as all Mesopotamian rulers, relied on sacred omens all time. No guards were with them. This time, Rimush's diviner was in the room not to read the future in sheep and trail. He quickly removed the chain with the royal seal he carried like a necklace. He jumped forward and put the necklace around the king's neck. King Rimush tried to fight back. He tried to breathe. He tried to call his guards, but the Barutu was able to strangle him. How ironic it must be to be murdered with your symbol of power. 9 years had passed since Sargon's death. The king is dead. Long live the king. Chaos once again gripped the empire. Rimush's younger brother Manishtushu was never intended to sit on the throne. But the late king didn't have suitable heirs. And so now the crown of Akkad was on Manishtushu's head. Once again a rebellion flared up. Once again it was quenched in fire and blood. It was the second time a huge rebellion had been defeated on the battlefield. Some had to think that it was impossible to beat Sargon's heirs. Others had to think that the days of strife were finally over. One document says that the Akkadian Empire traded with 37 different nations, some of them as far as India. If you watched the strange foreign ships at Mesopotamian quays, you would think that Sargon's dynasty was destined to be eternal. The future was wide open. When Naram-Sin became king in 2254 BCE, the Sargonic Empire was already 81 years old. Naram-Sin was Sargon's grandson. To the traditional royal titles of King of Akkad, King of Sumer, and King of the Universe, he added another one, King of the Four Quarters, meaning ruler of the entire world. He had to be very humble indeed. In his 36 years on the throne, Naram-Sin expanded the Akkadian Empire to astounding extremes. He led military campaigns abroad and plundered Anatolia, what's modern-day Turkey. The ultimate showcase of Naram-Sin's military prowess was the great sculpture known as the Victory Stele. It depicts the emperor in a horned helmet, trampling his enemies underfoot with his army following him. They are fighting in the mountains, east of Mesopotamia. The horned helmet has always been an impractical piece of armor for a warrior, and in the stele it has a symbolic meaning. It shows the war goddess Inanna's continued support for the Sargonic dynasty. According to the legends of old, it was this goddess that had blessed his grandfather Sargon. The stele is a clear propaganda piece meant to say something aloud. Inanna is with us. The heavens are with us. We have won against every single enemy. Don't ever dare to cross us. Naram-Sin kept his enemies at bay, quelled rebellions, looted, invaded, conquered and built. But there was something beyond his control. The weather. You can claim to be the king of the universe, but the universe doesn't care about what you have to say in this regard. Let's set up the scene. We are in a village in northern Mesopotamia, far from the hustling and bustling Sumerian cities of the south. The kings of Akkad have made great investments here. Many canals had been dug, diverting precious water from the two rivers to the farmland. Around these canals, hamlets and villages have spurred up. For a generation or two, everything seemed fine. The people living here always remained loyal to the Sargonic dynasty. A bunch of lads even went to war alongside the king. And look how rich the land they received in return is. But one day, something happened. Hot and dry winds carried sand from the desert. Then, one harvest failed. "Don't worry," someone said. "The king's granaries are rich and he will take care of us." Then, another harvest failed. People started to be worried. Someone moved south, leaving the village behind. Then the dust storms became stronger. Everything was covered with sand. To Akkadians and Sumerians alike, it must have felt like the end of the world. Had the king lost the favor of the gods? This calamity is now known as the 4.2 kiloyear event. For a pre-industrial farming society, this was a catastrophe. The economy became weaker, and so the central power could no longer resist external pressures. How can you call yourself the king of the universe when your soldiers have barely some bread to eat? Now weak, the empire would be crushed by the Gushans, a tribal confederacy hailing from the Zagros Mountains. Ironically, the same mountains depicted on the Victory Stele. The Sumerian King List, which was the document that recorded all the names of the rulers of Mesopotamia, simply says this: who was king? Who was not king? The Sargonic dynasty had come to an end, but the dream of a world-spanning empire would remain alive for thousands and thousands of years. The accomplishments of the Sargonic dynasty were so great that they redefined the very parameters of society and statecraft. They amply demonstrated the potential for global domination. We all know the names of great conquerors like Caesar, Alexander, and Napoleon. But like the Sargonic dynasty, their empires eventually crumble, as if turned to dust. Because remember, you can build a throne out of bayonets, but you can sit on it for long. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the Mesopotamian secret weapon, war wagons. Subscribe and hit the bell to not miss it. See you next time in the Mists of Time.